Hello everyone, today we read and comment the 8th chapter of the 4th book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. Its title being Mutual Understanding as to a Battle. The text follows. No battle can take place unless by mutual consent, and in this idea, which constitutes the whole basis of a duel, is the root of a certain phraseology used by historical writers, which leads to many indefinite and false conceptions. According to the view of the writers to whom we refer, it has frequently happened that one commander has offered battle to the other, and the latter has not accepted it. But the battle is a very modified duel, and its foundation is not merely in the mutual wish to fight, that is, in consent, but in the objects which are bound up with the battle. These belong always to a greater whole, and that so much the more as even the whole war considered as a combat unit has political objects and conditions which belong to a higher standpoint. The mere desire to conquer each other therefore falls into quite a subordinate relation, or rather it ceases completely to be anything of itself and only becomes the nerve which conveys the impulse of action from the higher will. Among the ancients, and then again during the early period of standing armies, the expression that we had offered battle to enemy in vain had more sense in it than it has now. By the ancients everything was constituted with a view to measuring each other's strength in the open field, free from anything in the nature of a hindrance, and the whole art of war consisted in the organization and formation of the army, that is, in the order of the battle. Or better, the order of battle. Now, as their armies regularly entrenched themselves in their camps, therefore the position in a camp was regarded as something unassailable, and a battle did not become possible until the enemy left his camp and placed himself in a practicable country, as it were entered the lists. If therefore we hear about Hannibal having offered battle to Fabius in vain, then tell us nothing more as regards the latter than a battle was not part of his plan, and in itself neither proves the physical nor moral superiority of Hannibal. But with respect to him, the expression is still correct enough in the sense that Hannibal really wished a battle. In the early period of modern armies, the relations were similar in great combats and battles. That is to say, great masses were brought into action and managed throughout it by means of an order of battle which, like a great helpless wall, required a more or less level plain and was neither suited to attack nor yet to defense in a broken, close, or even mountainous country. The defender therefore had here also to some extent the means of avoiding battle. These relations, although gradually becoming modified, continued until the First Silesian War, and it was not until the 7 Years' War that attacks an enemy posted in a difficult country gradually became feasible and of ordinary occurrence. Ground did not certainly cease to be a principle of strength to those making use of its aid, but it was no longer a charmed circle which shut out the natural forces of war. During the past 30 years, war has perfected itself much more in this respect, and there is no longer anything which stands in the way of a general who is in earnest about a decision by means of battle. He can seek out his enemy and attack him. If he does not do so, he cannot take credit for having wished to fight, and the expression he offered a battle which his opponent did not accept, therefore now means nothing more than he did not find circumstances advantageous enough for a battle, an admission which the above expression does not suit, but which it only strives to throw a veil over. It is true, the defensive side can no longer refuse a battle, yet he may still avoid it by giving up his position and the role with which that position was connected. This is, however, half a victory for the offensive side and an acknowledgment of his superiority for the present. This idea, in connection with the cartel of defiance, can therefore no longer be made use of in order by such rhodomontade to qualify the inaction of him whose part it is to advance, that is, the offensive. The defender who, as long as he does not give way, must have the credit of willing the battle, may certainly say he has offered it if he is not attacked, if that is not understood of itself. But on the other hand, he who now wishes to and can retreat cannot easily be forced to give battle. Now, as the advantages to the aggressor from this retreat are often not sufficient, and a substantial victory is a matter of urgent necessity for him, in that way the few means which there are to compel such an opponent also to give battle are often sought for and applied with particular skill. The principal means for this are first surrounding the enemy so as to make his retreat impossible, or at least so difficult that it is better for him to accept battle, and secondly, surprising him. This last way, for which there was a motive formerly in the extreme difficulty of all movements, has become in modern times very inefficacious. From the pliability and maneuvering capabilities of troops in the present day, one does not hesitate to commence a retreat even in sight of the enemy, and only some special obstacles in the nature of the country can cause serious difficulties in the operation. As an example of this kind, the Battle of Neresheim may be given, fought by the Archduke Charles with Moreau in the Rauhe Alp, August 11, 1796, merely with a view to facilitate his retreat, although we freely confess we have never been able quite to understand the argument of the renowned general and author himself in this case. The Battle of Rosbach, in another example, if we suppose the commander of the Allied army had not really the intention of attacking Frederick the Great. Of the Battle of Zohr, the king himself says that it was only fought because a retreat in the presence of the enemy appeared to him critical operation. At the same time, the king has also given other reasons for the battle. On the whole, regular night surprises excepted, such cases will always be of rare occurrence, and those in which an enemy is compelled to fight by being practically surrounded will happen mostly to single corps only, like Mortier at Dürrenstein, 1809, and Van Damme at Kulm, 1813. So in this agile chapter, von Clausewitz describes an evolution in the military art of his times, fundamentally, or almost, at least up to the 7 Years' War, he draws the line there, that brought fundamentally to the unlocking, we could use this term, of the entrenched positions right through the modern tactics of the time, so much that since ancient times, where the thing had begun, now battles cannot fundamentally be simply demanded, right, from therefore was going to attack unavoidably, or at least trying to negotiate the fight in that sense, and refused so that by the defender, so that the first one is not able to get the fight. Now, basically, you can dislodge an enemy from whichever position, right? This is something that happened for, a series of reasons. There are not merely, you may think it was, because of the improvements in artillery, those helped, of course, but generally speaking, this is about, as always, technology is never the answer without doctrine, and in the first place, it was mostly a political and social issue, right? The creation of national arms, and even before that, officially, the increase in size and in power, right? Even just in firepower, complexively, right? And the maneuverability, and in this sense also the agility of the armies to simply attack an enemy. An enemy, you can say, no matter which position he has taken. Von Clausewitz puts it here, even through the lines. It says, unless there is something about, of course, the terrain that is particularly, there are certain defenses, of course, that that couldn't be stormed even today, right? Without unless with an overwhelming amount of firepower. Think about World War I, right? How a machine gun could pin down thousands of soldiers at a time. And therefore those are the extremes in many ways, and also in a very different context for naturally Napoleonic times that von Clausewitz is describing. But objectively it is true, and von Clausewitz has also something to say about mountain warfare that by definition cannot be about a decisive engagement. It's not how here we should be careful, but we will talk about it on another occasion. Let's say normal conditions, you can't give battle fundamentally at every time, and this naturally entails that he who is demanded battle, that point is either to accept it or to retreat, because he cannot hold his position anymore, to say, okay, I remain entrenched in here, you cannot attack me. Now this is interesting because von Clausewitz, as you have listened, and we will see now better references to older times, into previous times, even in the early modern era, as a moment of saying, as long as the army remain in camp, you can't fundamentally attack it, right? There is an asymmetry that is very disadvantageous, and therefore, unless you don't have an overwhelming numerical superiority. I don't know. Think about the Battle of Valencia or these other contexts that were fought properly against fortifications, almost like in siege warfare, but still conceived as the Entscheidungsschlacht that we will see, in fact, in a while. In the next chapter, actually, the battle could be fundamentally refused, right? And this is particularly important because it makes you understand a lot of things, not just tactically, but strategically, right? And that's very, also with examples von Clausewitz provides, it's very clear. So, okay, mutual understanding as to a battle. No battle can take place unless by mutual consent, and in this idea, which constitutes the whole basis of a duel, is the root of a certain phraseology used by historical writers, which leads to many indefinite and false conceptions. Now, this thing of the duel is always very important, and always helps you to relate to it when you think about, what is war in a nutshell, in the essence. Well, it's just like a duel, right? Essentially, it is, right? It has it's naturally different in the way it happens, in the forms, in the application. It's something much more complicated, but in the essence, what moves a duel or a brawl, between two guys beating each other, is exactly the same thing, right? It's exactly the same thing. So you can relate very easily to that, and you understand even the statement naturally entails not an idealized and kind of romantic idea of what a duel could be. I don't know, maybe at the time between gentlemen, with all very staged, and ritualized way. In some ways, we're talking about literally what war is at the wildest, right? So this means that if you want to fight someone, of course the guy might be attacking that he's not aware of, so that's actually a very good advantage, but that tends to happen ever less in war in scale compared to a duel, right? But also, if the guy starts fighting, well, he's up to it for whichever reason, so that is consensual. It's characterized by this mutual consent, so that von Clausewitz says no battle can take place unless by mutual consent, right? This is extremely important. It's valid for every fight, you could say. So, and then he talks about these misconceptions that historical writers introduced. He says, according to the view of the writers to whom we refer, it has frequently happened that one commander has often offered battle to the other, and the latter has not accepted it. But the battle is a very modified duel, and its foundation is not merely in the mutual wish to fight. That is it, consent, but in the objects which are bound up with the battle. These belong always to a greater whole. He's talking about strategy here, of course. He says, and that's so much the more as even the whole war considered as a combat unit has political objects and conditions which belong to a higher standpoint. We have seen it all the times, right? Even if, there was total war as envisaged in a abstract reality, just to make us understand what that would be in practice, still that would be connected to politics in many ways. That is obviously abstract, so you would say what kind of politics would be at that point, but in fact that would be pure war, absolute war proper. But this is, in reality, of course, we cannot say that just because there is a war going on, two forces will attack each other immediately. We've seen it throughout all the whole book. And of course, what pertains in this regard to the battle proper is combat is tactics, right? So for whichever strategical reasons, this is still self-evident. You may not want to fight at that moment. And still, if even that was the case, there is always a political control on board that can, plug off the electricity, let's say, the energy at every single moment and doesn't matter what was military going on, they're called off, right? And the war stops. This is extremely important. We've repeated it ad nauseam in the previous books, but it's always worth remembering it. War is just a political instrument. Doesn't have, let's say, an independence on its own, right? It's independent conceptually as a field, right? It has its own logic and so on, but those are, you could say, always polluted by politics, right? That uses war just in an instrumental way, and therefore is the true mover of war. War doesn't exist by itself. There is not a space in which humans make war and another in which, the civil reality exists, right? It's the civil reality that makes war and controls it all the single time. So never, as we always say, never buy those things that say people, war is inhuman, is barbaric, is instinctual. It's, if anything, the complete opposite of each of all these things. It's fully human, probably one of the single most human things that exists in absolute terms, and it's fully as such. It's not barbaric, right? War is fought by civilizations, and barbarians suck at making war, generally speaking. Civilizations don't, and are overwhelmingly more powerful. Also, and especially, it's not instinctual. Humans want to live. They don't want to die, to go die, right? War is artificial. It's properly a creation of reason, and it works as such. Always remember this. This is elementary. If one doesn't start from this, you can understand anything about politics, about society, about war, because it's all one. And history is unintelligible unless you don't use this. And surprise, surprise, most people out there do not even know this connection exists. And then you wonder why we live in this world of gross historical and gross of political, social, and also military literacy in general. So what von Clausewitz is saying here is that, of course, the combat, as we have seen for the sake of didactics, we could say, has its own unity, right? A battle in itself is a monad on its own, we could say. It still overlaps other fields, but it's what altogether, for example, makes up eventually the strategic picture. It's somewhat well identifiable, usually in practice. But still, this combat unit has a meaning only if there is a war being fought, if there is a campaign, if there is a strategy, and it couldn't exist otherwise by definition. So, and von Clausewitz here stresses the fact, especially that these connections belong to a higher standpoint, right? For which, of course, the strategic decision in itself is more important than, you could say, than the battle in itself, at least in relative terms, because it precedes it. It probably makes it happen and gives it a meaning for which the battle is fought like. Also, not just why. And von Clausewitz says the mere desire to conquer each other therefore falls into quite a subordinate relation, or rather it ceases completely to be anything of itself and only becomes the nerve which conveys the impulse of action from the higher will, right? So, of course, if there is a war, it's because you're fighting against someone. But it's not that every time you're fighting against someone, you want to go out there and kill the person, or compel him better to fulfill your will, because this is the object of every war, from a military point of view, and also from a political one, telling the truth. And that's the meeting point we were talking about before. So, of course, this takes different forms in reality. And von Clausewitz makes these historical examples now, says amongst the ancients, and then again during the early period of standing armies, the expression that we had offered battle to the enemy in vain had more sense in it than it has now, right? That is not to say that properly there weren't conditions that were similar to the more modern ones from von Clausewitzian times. That is to say, every army was forced to give, could refuse battle if they wanted. Actually, they didn't, right? And not just because of those higher connections we're talking about before, that of course were, decisive, but properly also from a tactical point of view. Von Clausewitz says, by the ancients, everything was constituted with a view to well, about the tactical aspect, I was thinking, yeah, I mean, tendentially was like that too, but not always. This is what I wanted to punctualize. It says, by the ancients, everything was constituted with a view to measuring each other's strength in the open field, free from anything in the nature of hindrance. And the whole art of war consisted in the organization and formation of the army. It is in the order of battle. This is extremely important because it opens your eyes about what ancient warfare or medieval warfare practically were. Of course, in part by approximation, but also improperly, considering that, think about these major battles, there could be even multiple fronts. Think about the Second Punic War that von Clausewitz will now also mention. But generally speaking, one major strategic theater was led by one army, and most of the nuisances that derived aside from the logistical point of view and so on, that are not properly military by definition, but it was properly how, what was the army about, right? How it was composed, how many troops, which troops, and so on. And fundamentally, the whole thing revolved around the battle, because it was miraculous for those time standards to even put together things like 50,000 men, right? They were the maximum you will ever find in the ancient world, realistically, right? It's kind of ridiculous. There are all those fun boys on YouTube that think to quote historical sources by saying, historical sources that there were 300,000 men, or the Persians invaded Greece with 1 million men. Yes, and you think that you believe it's actual reality, right? Good luck with that. But aside from these notes that I often feel the need to point out, because let's be honest, I'm making these videos and I think you are intelligent. I deal with you, taking the average follower, someone they understand perfectly these things, right? But I realize that this is for the average. There is someone out there that doesn't realize it. And this is a serious problem. It's part of the reason why we were saying before things suck dramatically, also from a political and social point of view, because a person doesn't understand that for military history will have great difficulties in dimensioning reality at so many other levels, right? And this cannot be concealed, right? We have to be quite honest about it. Also, von Clausewitz says, so in many ways, to complete the explanation was giving, what the army did in that theater was all about what strategically the theater was about, right? It's very important. Think about Hannibal's army in Italy, right? It was all about the army in many ways. Like the Roman Schwerpunkt was properly Hannibal's army in many ways. Take that out, the thing is over. For Hannibal was convincing properly the Italics to join him against Rome. Von Clausewitz says, so it was all about the army and how it was composed. Now, and this up to the Renaissance and beyond, this is very interesting as a view, because the army was central in there, because it was properly the one, think about this great medieval battles that were fought and decided the international situation of a broader strategic theater for like 200 years, right? Because those armies costed so freaking lot for the society of those times in terms of crop rate, demographics, etc. That just a massive defeat in a pitched battle at that point meant the shift of enormous resources, historically speaking. So von Clausewitz says, now as their armies regularly entrenched themselves, because this happened a freaking lot too, in their camps, and not only camps, right? Here we can't talk about camps, but also major fortifications. If you look at medieval history, you'll see how sophisticated that actually was. And exactly to save, it was an economical thing. It was a negotiation in properly, as von Clausewitz uses fundamentally this bargaining as a valid metaphor for war. It says, therefore the position in a camp was regarded as something unassailable, and a battle did not become possible until the enemy left his camp and placed himself in a practicable country, and as it were entered the lists, right? This is absolutely spot on, right? As you know, I researched about fundamentally the 13th and 14th century. This is the reality of warfare at the time. You can't give battle only if the guy comes out of his entrenchment. There's no other way, right? And he may have actually pretty important reasons for doing that. So this is, let's say, this is very important because also on the basis of what we wrote on other, what we saw actually on Von Clausewitz, that the larger the army is, and of course the least the importance of field fortifications was. So it's rarer objectively to see enormous armies, that concentrate these overwhelming resources that go to make, I don't know, to besiege a city without hoping in the meanwhile to go to battle, right, and achieve that overwhelming, potentially overwhelming success or disaster at the same time. But the other, the average expeditions are instead very well entrenched in this regard, so that, okay, we can't, the enemy can stay next door beyond the ditches and the palisades as much as we want, but until we don't come out, he cannot attack us, or he can't do it, but we'll lose, right? And that explains things like encapsulation, fortifications, and so on, and the eventual change to the cordwood artillery. Is also what Von Clausewitz is saying here. It's how it changed, and we will see it in a while. Before Von Clausewitz makes this example about Hannibal, and Quintus Fabius Maximus says, if therefore we hear about Hannibal having offered battle to Fabius in vain, right? You know what the whole strategic deal at that point was after Cannae. The scorched earth strategy. Hannibal wanted to defeat the Romans, almost succeed. In open field, again, almost succeeded, right? While Fabius countered him, which wasn't at all decisive, but just practical. And the only thing the Romans could do at that point after Cannae in Italy, and Hannibal wanted to give battle, and Fabius refused. So Claudius says that tells us nothing more as regards to the latter than that a battle was not part of his plan, and in itself neither proves the physical nor moral superiority of Hannibal. But with respect to him, the expression is still correct enough in the sense that Hannibal really wished a battle. It's important, the subtlety he stresses here, because he says, it's not that Hannibal wanted to give battle necessarily because that means he was objectively superior, right? Of course, the Romans feared his tactical skills. The whole deal was that, challenge the Romans to in open field and try dare, to tag, to fight with me. That I'm basically the greatest commander of the time, and that revolution, in a sense, warfare, in the conceptual sense of how troops had to be employed overall. And von Clausewitz, in fact, he actually doesn't make the link, but he expresses that, criticizing the theories that had come out in the last generations of these about what is that a battle should be fought like. And Hannibal is the one that actually invented the idea that it's not just like hammer and anvil, like Philip II and Alexander III of Macedonia had fully developed in that sense. Hannibal does something that has been said objectively has not been changed in warfare ever since, because that's the last stage in many ways. That is, that the battle plan is conceiving the whole forces in a synergic sense that basically reconnect on the field in. It's not just about the unpredictability of it, but properly the synergic use of all of the elements, not just in a simple combined arm tactics, in a dual arm sense, but in every single possible advantage that it can have, right? And don't think, for example, that, medieval warfare didn't achieve that. They did. It was the same thing. And modern warfare in this sense should be analyzed in different ways, because there were very different ratios of forces that needed to redraw essentially how, tactics had to be conceived. This is all the renaissance of fort to deal now with this new problem posed by the pikes from one side, by the shot from the other. But still, conceptually, the concept is the same, and how these tactical logics eventually evolve over time is relatively secondary, right? but the objective is always that synergic approach to it. So von Clausewitz says it's not even about the fact that Hannibal could say, okay, I will, as soon as we'll go to battle, I will surely win. Because no general in history has ever even hoped to think anything like that, right? There is this kind of machistic-like attitude. That guy knew since the beginning he would win because he was a master. This garbage. No, every general knows that the more genial his plan is, the more daring it is, and the more the risk does increase, right? And this is why Hannibal was considered at the time, after of course Alexander the Great and Pyrrhus of Epirus, the greatest commander that had ever lived, right? Among that's the contemporary ranking at the time. Some say Pyrrhus is overrated, but let's be honest, in that regard, he allegedly Hannibal said it himself, right? He did the famous meeting in Antioch when he was asked allegedly by Saint Scipio. We want to believe it's true, even if we can't say that. That if he had wanted Zama, he would have been the first, right? He plays himself, right? This is a kind of an anecdote, but naturally also the same history of Battle of Zama was, Hannibal was pretty, aware what also the situation was and what he could attempt and what he couldn't. So that's a bit of a myth, but in terms of the historical, press of of the time, we can say this is how they had perfectly rationalized the fact that this man had achieved something nobody had ever seen before in many ways. The point is, Hannibal really wished for a battle. Right? That's the extremely important thing. Right? Then, how the battle would have been fought is well another matter, and we'll see it better in the next chapter that actually deals with this specific issues, the Entscheidungsschlacht, right? The decisive battle as properly, and the decision of the battle at the same time, right? How is that also generals perceive the, how the balance is swinging, how the odds are oscillating. Von Clausewitz says then, in the early period of modern armies, their relations were similar in great combats and battles, right? That is to say, great masses were brought into action and managed throughout it by means of an order of battle which, like a great helpless wall, required a more or less level plain, and was neither suited to attack nor yet to defense in a broken, close, or even mountainous country, right? So, not much had changed, right? Practically, unless this, other, the terrain or other aspects. And says the defender therefore had here also to some extent the means of avoiding battle. Worked pretty much in the same way. These relations, although gradually becoming modified, because think about artillery, think about the evolution also of fortifications, the disappearance actually of fortifications overall, and the centralization of fortification also in that regard, the fall of castles, and so very different realities, but at the same time also armies were increasing in size, so that was still balanced. Clausewitz says this thing continued until the First Silesian War, and it was not until the 7 Years' War that attacks an enemy posted in a difficult country gradually became feasible and of ordinary occurrence. Right? The 7 Years' War began to dynamicize a lot. Right? It already began, he says, for the mid-18th century, but the broader picture is that now, as we were saying before, armies are larger, have a greater firepower. So the thing of entrenching oneself starts becoming inconsistent, right? At the point it's abandoned fundamentally. Von Clausewitz says, ground did not certainly cease to be a principle of strength to those making use of its aid, right? This never flattened the importance of terrain, that it remains always the protagonist of each battle, but it was no longer a charmed circle which shut out the natural forces of war. So, in many ways now, the battlefield became boundless in its reachability, we could say. Every terrain fundamentally maintain this character. Okay, theoretically we can't fight here, and reasons why also the enemy, because it's not just finding the spot that gives you the the advantage of terrain. We've seen there are lots of other occurrences that bring you to fight in the first place. So even going to fight in very difficult terrain, it's not really advantageous, and it's advantageous up to a certain point. That may choke your supply lines, for example. It could be destroyed when even fighting. So this is truer considering, as we've seen, the reasons that brought the whole thing to change gradually. Armies became larger, bulkier, heavier, more expansive. So it's not that you can't make them fight in inaccessible places all the time. It's actually a risk. It's almost a waste, right? In strategic terms. So this is really very important as a concept too. So Von Clausewitz says, during the past 30 years, war has perfected itself much more in this respect, and there is no, so this started to take a shape on its own. The military art adapted in this regard. There is no longer anything which stands in the way of a general who is in earnest about a decision by means of battle. Right? It's as if tactics got closer to strategy. Indeed, if you look at even just the numbers that fought in Napoleonic Wars, never been seen. Right? Those numerical limits we're talking about before were surpassed. Think about all the scientific improvements of this time. Think about communications. Think about logistics. I mean, there is all a very important change in the way the world, not just the battle, was seen. So all this began to allow essentially a general that wanted to fight to pose the enemy, as we will see now, in the condition of saying, okay, either I accept or I cannot hold this position and I must retreat therefore. He says he can seek out his enemy and attack him. If he does not so, he cannot take credit for having wished to fight, and the expression he offered a battle which his opponent did not accept therefore now means nothing more than he did not find circumstances advantageous enough for a battle, and an admission which the above expression does not suit, but it only strives to throw a veil over. What does this mean? It means that, of course, he who retreats at that point, when he's given battle, cannot always be accused of, okay, you were weaker. Right, and for those that will make it clear now, says basically it's a temporary accomplishment, and in a way, it's even a disadvantage. It's a half victory to challenge someone to fight, and eventually, this guy, slipping away, because in theory you should have already kind of foreseen that, and the greater the battle is, the greater this dynamic is there, and equally, now that there are other complications, because naturally also the greater it is from the other side, and even in there why he's the guy there for, so that's why generally speaking the great battle will eventually happen, right? But in this sense there is still enough room for playing, right? Let's say, okay, I don't want to give battle here, we'll give it somewhere else. Think about, I don't know, the war of the Fifth Coalition after Ulm up to Austerlitz, right? That advanced throughout Central Europe by Napoleon that had to properly, there was all a very delicate strategical balance, the outstretching of the supply lines, the enemies also, having to keep their armies for a long time. So the decision of the battle in that regard was also connected precisely to certain choices regarding the terrain and position. Here, it was about giving battle properly one place and waiting from the Allied side how Napoleon would have been worn out, and of course we know that being Austerlitz being the greatest masterpiece in Napoleonic warfare. But we'll see it perhaps on another occasion. So Von Clausewitz is basically saying, okay, that there is enough room sometimes to retreat without saying, okay, you were just weaker. Okay, you may have actually had a good reason for it. Von Clausewitz says, it is true the defensive side can no longer refuse a battle. This is the point. Yet he may still avoid it by giving up his position and the role with which that position was connected. This is, however, half a victory for the offensive side, as we've seen it before, and an acknowledgement of his superiority for the present, not necessarily for the future. Clausewitz goes on and says, this idea in connection with the cartel of defiance can therefore no longer be made use in order by such rhodomontade to qualify the inaction of him whose part is to advance, that is the offensive. The defender, as long as he does not give way, must have the credit of willing the battle, may certainly say he has offered it, and if he is not attacked, if that is not understood of itself. Right. This is self-explanatory. Von Clausewitz also writes, this is also important, but on the other hand, he who now wishes to and can retreat cannot easily be forced to give battle. Right now, as the advantages to the aggressor from this retreat are often not sufficient, and a substantial victory is a matter of urgent necessity for him, in that way the few means which there are to compel such an opponent also to give battle are often sought for and applied with this particular skill. Right, so as we were saying before, there are strategic, logics that are always played in here, not just to search for the battle, but properly even to make the enemy fight at, we can say properly your own conditions, which is, never fully attainable, because, at your conditions it would be surrender, if we want to be absolute in this regard. But properly, the same employed of the armed forces is to be carried out with the objective of bringing, also considering the balance, it will bring the enemy to be willing to fight, because he who attacks, generally speaking, is also spending a freaking lot of resources for advancing, for for simply attacking. That, as we have seen, is obviously the most expensive thing to do, right, strategically speaking. Now, von Clausewitz says the principal means for this are first surrounding the enemy so as to make his retreat impossible. So this is a very good way actually to oblige the enemy to give battle, which is evident, or at least so difficult. This is also important, and it makes you understand that how gradual this can be. That it's better for him to accept battle, right? So if you find yourself surrounded, maybe not completely, but breaking through the enemy lines becomes too risky. Sometimes, it's better to give battle, and whatever it goes, right? It would be a lost chance in some ways. And secondly, surprising him. So what we were saying at the beginning about the duel, right? You catch someone by surprise, and therefore the guy does, he's kind of, for some reason, is obliged to fight at that point. Hopefully for you. And Foucault says this last way, for which there was a motive formerly in the extreme difficulty of all movements, has become in modern times very inefficacious. Right? And this is self-evident. Right? You could try to surprise the enemy in this trigger. Thinking about always the Second Punic War, the Battle of the Trasimene Lake. Those were some major armies out there at the time, and it was possible for each other to surprise each other. In fact, even Austerlitz that we were talking about before actually was fought like that. Napoleon exploited every single inch of the battlefield, the weather, the fog, as you know. There are beautiful passages in that. Also, literally speaking, War and Peace. I don't know, and there was a general surprise. But in that case, in Napoleonic times, the surprise was just about, I don't know, how the troops were arrayed in that sense, not in the fact that he wanted to give battle in the first place. And the reason why Clausewitz says that, of course, it's become almost impossible to surprise someone so that to oblige him to give battle is that armies have become so large that objectively it's impossible not to know what they are, what they're doing, right? Another thing that it's always expandable as an advice, talking about military history, never think that, like, armies kind of wander around and nobody knows they're there. Like, normally a major army moves, you know that months and months in advance, right? Whether you can't put together enough forces to counter that is well another thing, but there's no thing like the army appeared from nowhere and everybody was surprised, right? It doesn't work like that. Armies leave enormous amount of traces everywhere, right? Of news, of information. It's out there under the eyes of everybody. So this has become, at an operational level, for what combat tactical engagements are concerned, impossible in many ways. Think about today, right? Naturally, the smaller a unit is, and the more actually surprise can be achieved. But as you understand, also the result, the outcome will be less important, strategically speaking, because it's a small unit, right? Whereas, how can you conceal today where an army is? With phones, with satellites, with all the possible imaginable means of communication we have, right? Surprise is over in some way. Surprise leaves on and can be dramatically important, if not decisive, in many occasions. In fact, how these troops are employed eventually also in the battle, or also strategically sometimes, but given a situation that is not surprising by itself, right? When will the enemy attack? Think about the battlefields of World War I, right? It's not that surprise could be achieved. Like, the trenches didn't move from the channel to Switzerland for, if not a few tens of kilometers in 4 years of war. So there was no surprise of any kind. But what the world strategic deal was, but just and in fact, to concentrate why the whole thing remained there, because wherever the enemy tried to break in some place, it had to amass hundreds of thousands of troops, starting preparatory bombing. It was something so evident. You could even make, of course, you could try to disorient the enemy, starting bombing another section of the trenches, all this stuff. But generally speaking, major offensives were no surprise. It was just a matter of saying when will it happen, and do we have enough means to counter them. And this is essentially how it went. Think about, the Eastern Front during World War II. Well, in that case, the Nazis brutally underestimated even just the number of Soviet divisions, for example. At the beginning of the war, it's in many ways also the reason why they lost. But because the plan contemplated a wholly different picture in some ways. But of course, when troops were engaged, more or less you had an idea of how much force there was in front of you. On the broader, army corps level, throughout all the front, you knew how many enemies were there. The main problem was, how eventually the battle would have been fought, and that could surprise you in some ways. Think about the Battle of Kursk, right? But even if you think during the World War I, the Battle of the Somme, Verdun, right? People say, that was madness, but consider that nobody had ever even tried to do something like that before. Like that today, we do know that you get bogged down in certain terrain that liquefies after heavy bombing, that that what the whole concentration of forces can be. Nobody had ever even attempted something there before. We didn't have the data, so it wasn't stupid to do it. It was actually very clever. World War I strategy and tactics are one of the most radically sophisticated warfare in the history of mankind. People still thinking of stupid generals sending guys to get killed by bayonets and shells. That's utter insane. That was a coldly logic and extremely refined and an intelligent way of fighting. Right? It's simply that such huge enterprises have never been seen before. It's just like from Clausewitz times with Napoleonic warfare. Nobody had ever seen that amount of men put on the field. Nobody in the history of mankind. It had never happened because the means that existed at the Italian nation state had never existed before. So always take this in perspective, historically speaking, because nobody can know what happens. There's not the internet genius that comes out and says, I would have done different because it was so smart and understand better than everybody. No, you're just a charlatan, right? And these are all lessons learned for eventually what what has improved afterwards. So that, unfortunately, I know, especially after about World War the First, the prejudices about the a lot of things, even just the technological. For many people, World War the First was dictated by technology. People will reason like this do not have the slightest idea what military history is, not the slightest. This is World War the First, probably the most prejudiced in terms of the scale of importance of the war, historically speaking. It's probably the most biased. Right, World War II is, in political terms, I would say, World War I is most misunderstood in military terms, because people do not understand how it was fought on a regular base and think it's easy, right? Because what you have to think about is the trenches, right? Just if you have played Call of Duty, you can't think like that, right? Read stuff about World War I. And the enormous improvements in civilization that brought. Think about medicine, think about technology, broadly meant, right? But this is very interesting to see in perspective. We don't talk about contemporary warfare a lot because we stop fundamentally to the Napoleonic era, at the latest. Mostly stop the Renaissance warfare technology, but we'll have to talk about World War I to make some, Schwerpunkt pills to tell you, look, beware that lots of myths out there that are very dangerous for the understanding of history. So that's the point von Clausewitz was making, right? Surprise cannot be achieved easily anymore, especially for large armies. Then von Clausewitz says, for the pliability and maneuvering capabilities of troops in the present day, one does not hesitate to commence a retreat, even in sight of the enemy, and only some special obstacles in the nature of the country can cause serious difficulties in the operation. Right? This is clear, right? The strategic mobility, we could call it, of armies at this point are, either there is like a ridge, something can take a lot of time just to be passed, a major river, something that slows down eventually, but, generally speaking, the country as such is, it's crossable, it's fordable in many ways, very speedily without hindrance. Naturally, this is by giving for granted that everything, the army is well supplied, that the country sometimes is not being devastated. Some, smaller armies can also live off the land in the Napoleonic era. That von Clausewitz will explain that this is not important now, but just for stating that in optimal conditions, even just on average conditions, right? Armies can move from any position pretty quick, pretty swiftly, let's say. Then von Clausewitz makes some example from recent times. He says, as an example of this kind, the Battle of Neresheim may be given, fought by Archduke Charles with Moreau in the Raue Alp on August 11, 1796, merely with a view to facilitate his retreat, although we freely confess we have never been able quite to understand the argument of the renowned general and the author himself in this case. Archduke Charles was one of the greatest Austrian generals at the time. So managed the Battle of Rossbach, famously fought November the 5th, 1757. It's another example. We suppose the commander of the Allied army had not really the intention of attacking Frederick the Great. Of the Battle of Zoll, the king, Frederick, himself says that it was only fought because a retreat in the presence of the enemy appeared to him a critical operation. At the same time, the king has also given other reasons for the battle. So you see, it's a mix. Zoll it was fought on September the 30th, 1745. And von Clausewitz concludes by saying, on the whole, regular night surprises accepted, because that's a problem. Think about the Battle of Ulm. in 1805. Such cases will always be of rare occurrence, and those in which an enemy is compelled to fight by being practically surrounded will happen most to single corps only, so not to the entire armies, like Mortier at Durenstein in 1809 and Van Damme at Kulm in 1813. Alright. And this is it, and next time we'll see actually chapter 9, the Entscheidungsschlacht, one of the most beautiful, and it's one of the pillars of the Vom Kriege actually, and it's very long, but I think we will actually tell it all in one shot, in one video, because it's of dramatic importance. This other one was shorter, but it's really great. I'm glad we arrived to this point. We'll see what we can do in the future. We read and commented most of the Vom Kriege. Alright, so for now stop here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and